Hi, this is a presentation about how to do a critical review. A number of you are going to be doing these in your 903 projects, so we thought we'd pull it all together, have the presentation available to you so you can go back and refer to it when you need it. It's going to be a little bit different perhaps depending on the supervisor that you have, but this is enough to give you the bare bones. And I like to think of critical reviews as, well, it's sort of like eating an elephant, isn't it? I mean, the job's got to be done. It's very important. It's very useful. But if we get organized and we look at it one step at a time, it'll all come together. She said, I promise. Okay, so anyway, a critical review. Why do we actually need critical reviews? Well, we need to look at our evidence base because the profession is still growing its evidence base. When you go looking for research that occupational therapists did, sometimes it's a bit of a struggle. We're still building that research. So when we go looking, we need to know what's useful out there and where the gaps are. Also, there's been a lot of pressure to publish in the past. That used to be a very big thing. Get publications out there, and they were not necessarily the highest quality of evidence because sometimes the methods were a little flawed. Also, over time, we've learned to be more rigorous in our design, how to carry out research in much more methodical and reliable way. So we need to take a little bit of a critical eye when we're looking at publications. The other thing that we need critical reviews for is because, and you've experienced this already, there is this explosion of information. There is just so much. And you go, well, where do I start and what should I go with? And it's not very good practice to just start with the top 3 Google hits that you find, right? Because they may be popular, but they may not actually be the best way forward. So there's a lot of reasons why we need critical review. Now, critical reviews, a little bit different than systematic reviews. Well, actually quite a bit different. A systematic review, typically, is a collection of randomized trials that have been reviewed for their methodological rigor so that they can be combined and determine whether we have sufficient quality of evidence or not to do something with confidence, to use a certain intervention with confidence. Systematic reviews, though, are typically based on randomized control trials. Now, a lot of what occupational therapy is interested in doesn't lend itself to an RCT, and we've already talked a lot about that in 566, why that's a flawed assumption. So sometimes a systematic review is not what we actually need, and instead a group of researchers at McMaster University about, well, it's almost 15 years ago now, started to look at this whole question, like how will we grow our evidence base? How will we find the synthesis of information that we need as occupational therapists? And they called themselves the Occupational Therapy Evidence-Based Practice Research Group and developed an evaluation process for both quantitative and qualitative research to help us understand, are we looking at good research? Can we confidently implement the findings from this research? So those are the forms that you used in your 566. All of you have had experience reviewing at least 2 qualitative studies and 2 quantitative studies now. So you're already ahead of the game, right? You know how those forms work. And you know that they also guide us through the quality indicators. What makes for a good study of either a quantitative or a qualitative design? So we've got all of that together now, and that's why we need critical reviews as well as the systematic reviews. Not all of our questions are going to be answered by RCTs. Oops, sorry, I'm flipping around back and forth here. There we go. Okay, so critical reviews, what they are. A critical review is a very standardized process. You don't just make it up as you go along. So there is a protocol, and if you walk through the steps, you'll get what you're looking for. If you hop and skip all over the place, you may end up with a mess, and then you're going to be frustrated and it'll just be a lot of work. So you need to be meticulous about this, right? You have to follow the method, and we're going to walk through the steps in this presentation. Because if you do the steps in the right order and you are meticulous, then you know at the end you can be confident in your findings. If you've been jumping all over the place, then you're going to think, did I miss something? Is this really everything that's out there? How am I going to, demonstrate that I actually was scientific in my approach? It's important to be methodical. A critical review is grounded in the principles of evidence-based research. And like I talked about a little before, it's similar to systematic review, but it's not exactly the same thing. And for our purposes here, we follow the format that's provided by the McMaster Group. And again, that's because they're occupational therapists who wrote that method for occupational therapists. So it just makes sense. It's not the same as a literature review. A literature review, you sort of hunt around and you're selective about what you do or don't look at. When you do a critical review and you have a question, you can't come into it with a preconceived notion. I am trying to find evidence to support doing bunion therapy. Right? That's not appropriate. We have to have a more open mind and say, I'm looking for the quality of the evidence, either for or against, but what is the quality of the studies that have been done looking at bunion therapy as an intervention. So I'm going to use bunion therapy here because I don't think we do it, but no one should be offended, right? So it's not the same as a literature critique. And the other key thing you need to keep in mind about doing a critical review, where a lot of people go wrong, is they try to make their critical review about OT theory or about OT roles. So they might have a question, what is the role of occupational therapy in bunion therapy? Well, you can't answer that with a critical review. Critical reviews are for outcomes, right? We're looking at outcomes, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So here's your essential resources. This is what you need to get together. The Canadian Occupational Therapy Foundation has actually, they give grants. Once a year they do a grant for anyone to do a critical review. And these grants are quite competitive. I'm going to give you an example of a publication at the end of this presentation that received one of these grants to do a critical review and then was published. So you'll see what a quality report looks like. Then you want to get a hold of your law textbook. There's some additional information in there. It's not essential, but it's helpful. Most of what you need you can get off of the COTF website though, so I wouldn't worry too much about not having the law textbook. Then there's an article in OT Now that Stuart and a group wrote back in 1999, but they actually walk through the steps of doing a critical review. So that's very useful, right? So you have the background right there. And then you all have your Greenhow textbook, how to read a paper, and that will be invaluable when you start to do your critique of the different pieces of evidence that you found. So what are the steps, okay? So step one, you have to select a relevant and a meaningful topic. Relevant to occupational therapy, something that's meaningful to you, because otherwise you're going to be very frustrated with this. You spend a lot of time with your 903 project. You want to make sure that it makes you happy, right? That you feel inspired about it. So remembering the purpose is to evaluate the effectiveness of an intervention, not about roles or beliefs or attitudes, but where you actually do something, an intervention, and you want to see if it's effective. That's what critical reviews guide us through. So an outcome study. So for example, the use of crafts in programs for clients with learning disabilities. Well, that's an outcome, right? You're doing an intervention and you want to see what the outcome of that intervention is. However, a topic like the role of OT in learning disabilities, that won't fit a critical review process. That's a different question, a different study. Okay? So if you're doing a critical review in your 903, you have to leave those kinds of questions in your to look at later file for now. So what's the second step? You design your search strategy, just like you did in your Scopus assignment. You sit down, you think about, here's my question, how do I break it down? And it's important to do that, because if you don't, you're going to just be buried in information, and it'll take you far longer than it really needs to. You're going to waste a lot of your time, and you won't be able to justify your findings. So make sure that you take the time, sit, think, refine your search, and then the librarians can help you after you've refined your search. We're going to be giving you a worksheet to help you work through this, like what to take to the librarians so that they can most effectively help you. But don't just go like a little bird going, oh, help me, help me, help me, because they can't, right? You have to think it through first and discuss it with your supervisor. That's what they're there for. So you have your question, you design your search strategy. Okay, so just a little bit more about expert in the field. How you would approach them is just to say, I am an MSc student. For my final capping exercise, I'm doing a critical review of whatever topic. These are the search terms I've been using to look for the literature, and I just wanted to double check, would you be able to tell me if I have missed any terms, or if you're aware of any coming publications that are perhaps in press or haven't been released yet. And then you just thank them very kindly for their time. And you know, if you pick 2 or 3 experts in the field, you almost always hear back from, sometimes you hear from all of them, but always you'll hear from at least one. The way you find them is just to look for the corresponding author box on the journal articles that you're reading. So if you're reading a lot of stuff around bunion therapy, just look and see who are the authors that are publishing in that area. Find the corresponding authors, their link, and you take it from there. And as long as you're very professional and respectful, so that means not hi Jeannie, it means hi Dr. Smith, right? But I don't need to tell you guys that. So you've done all of that. Part of your process too, remember specificity and selectivity, we talked about that. Sometimes you need to be more specific, sometimes you need to be more selective. So do you need to broaden your search or do you need to narrow your search? Then at the end of the day, you may find, well, I'll just take a little step back. Okay, so you define your scope, you define the language, you have some limits, some date ranges perhaps, but remember, very good quality research may have happened in 1984. So you don't want to just arbitrarily pick a date to exclude things, and we've talked a lot about that. You want to pick the type of publication, right? Do you really need to go into the gray literature? Because it's not going to be as rigorous, obviously, gray literature, as if you're going with peer-reviewed publications. And then, you know, there will be some other features you can pick depending on the database that you're using. Okay, so here's a little bit more about that expert in the field, right? Who do you ask to give you feedback? You look at the journal articles for the corresponding author. You should do that as quickly as possible because it takes time, right? And people can't respond to you at the drop of a hat. So always just doing these little steps. It helps to break down your whole 903 project into, like, do an activity analysis on it, and a whole bunch of little tiny steps that all added together make up your project. And then you can go through and feel good about what you've done that week and go tick, yes I did that, tick, yes I did that, tick, 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 right? And eventually you've got the whole thing together. So how do you do it? You can email them, but like I said, be very respectful, use their title, doctor or professor or whatever it is, explain who you are, why you're asking them, you know, give them sufficient time that they can actually get back to you. And then when they do get back to you, be sure and say thank you. And I feel ridiculous having to tell you this, but I also know that it happens. People don't always remember to say thank you. Okay, so now you run your search strategy. When you're running your search strategy, you want to write down the dates and the databases that you used when you run it, because you're not going to keep going back, right? If you've refined your search, you're happy with it, you run it on February 1st, then you note that down for your paper. On February 1st, I ran my search strategy, here's what I got. You don't keep going back and back and back or you'll never finish. Then you just keep a little log for yourself. Were there any problems or did you have to make any changes? This is part of what you will put into your report when you talk about your methods, right? Your decision-making trail. Then you develop your inclusion-exclusion criteria for what you retrieve through your search. So are you going to take only certain types of studies because they are very closely aligned and you can be very specific? Or are you going to narrow the type of intervention at this point? Maybe before you were looking at all splints, but what you really, really are interested in is only dorsal dynamic splints. So now's when you can start to fiddle around a bit, okay? Looking at the sample size, what client group is involved in the research. And then finally looking at can I afford to now be more selective in terms of the type of research? Before, maybe they were just looking at range of motion. You know, I got everything, and range of motion is useful, but oh, there are so many studies that take it even further and they talk about function. Well, then maybe you can exclude some of those range of motion ones. Okay, so you have to make some decisions at this point, and again, you just jot down what you did, why you did it. That's your decision-making trail. At this point, some of you are going to go, oh my goodness, I found nothing. Now, this is when you need to talk to your supervisor, but in a true critical review, that doesn't mean that you have to change your question, right? If you can demonstrate that you followed the method and you constructed a good search and you looked at all of the information that was available and you looked everywhere that was possible to look and you still found no relevant evidence, then those are your findings. You followed the critical review method, but you had no findings. So then what you would do is spend the rest of the paper discussing the implications of having no findings, and also discussing what type of a research study, where should we start with research then to answer the need for evidence in this area. Okay, so it doesn't mean you throw the whole thing in the garbage and go, oh my goodness, I've got to start all over again and it's just too hard and I don't know what to do. All right, it's not a treasure hunt. It's not about you must have 15 papers to do a proper critical review, or 5 or 10 or 25. That's all arbitrary. If you, in research, you do you follow the method and you get what you get. So you need to discuss this with your supervisor more, but that's my advice to students, and that's the way you would follow the process as it's outlined. Okay, so a little bit more. You record the articles that you included and keep a short table of the ones you excluded. Okay, so you can do that on your printout when you do the search. Just say, oh, and these ones I excluded, because you'll have to explain why. Why did you throw those ones out? Well, they were all just about range of motion, but they didn't really talk about function. Okay? And you want to do that in a clear, orderly fashion, but it's only a half-hour task, right? So put it down some afternoon. You just sort of sit down, do that little thing, tick your boxes. Yes, I've got my exclusion criteria explained and tabled and stuff like that. Okay, because otherwise you're going to be trying to do this at the last minute and you won't remember, and it'll drive you crazy, and then you'll cut corners and your paper will look like, I'm not sure, I don't really understand it, and then you're going to get all kinds of questions perhaps at your defense that'll make you very anxious and won't be, you know, they won't show that you actually understand the process. So just keeping track of these things will help you a lot at the end of the day. So those are the steps to get the material. And like I said, if you don't get anything, then you move to a different type of analysis. You talk about implications now. And you talk about where we should go from here. But say you've come across, or your search has retrieved 8 relevant pieces of information. So now you sit down and you critically review them, and you use those data extraction forms that you've used before in 566. The other thing, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a bit, if you modify the form for some reason, and you might need to, again, you do this in collaboration with your supervisor, you'd also record what modification you made and why. Okay? So you're just keeping track of this. The other caution at this point is to not fall uncritically for just going, oh, well, this is an RCT, so it must be good, because we know that from class. RCTs can be poorly done. The methods can be somewhat flawed, right? So you still have to review them all. So at this stage, now when you're critiquing them, you're using those guidelines from the McMaster group, you're using your Greenhow textbook, you're using other resources that have been put on the website for you on the e-class, I believe it'll be on e-class, that has background documents about bias, all kinds of other resources are available to you, right, depending on how scholarly you want your work to be. So now you're starting to look at the methodological quality of the evidence, because that's how we determine whether it's generalizable, is it methodologically sound, was there sufficient sample size, and there's additional resources that are being posted for you about sample size. What does that mean? What does power calculation mean? Questions like, was there sufficient follow-up? Questions, what type of bias may or may not have been present? All of those things, but you've already spent time with those, so good for you. Now you're just refining that a little bit more, right? So that's the third step. Then there's this other little fourth step I've thrown in here, and that's if you end up looking at a randomized control trial in your critical review, because you may have found a randomized control trial that's very relevant, usually people would add on one additional quality indicator, and they look at randomization. Was the study properly randomized? And the Haddad scale is what's used for this. It's only 4 short questions, and you find it by going to this reference. Haddad assessing the quality of reports of randomized clinical trials. Okay, is blinding necessary? So there's the reference for it, and if you have RCTs that come up in your search, then it's good practice to use this. It shows advanced scholarship because you're also looking at randomization and blinding, which is not dealt with in detail in the McMaster process. So a little bit more about these steps. It's always a good idea to set up a buddy system, right? So you're going to review somebody else's data extraction forms, and they're going to review some of yours. So you're doing a little audit check, and you're helping each other out that way, because for sure somebody else will see something you missed and vice versa. You want to compare notes. You want to make sure in advance, though, how you decide if you have a disagreement, how you're going to deal with it. Okay? So this is where you want to get involved with other people who are in your group or your friends and form a support network. The other thing you want to be doing is putting your fingers in your ear and not listening. One finger in each ear, not all fingers in one ear. Don't listen to rumors. I can't stress this enough. Every single group will be run slightly differently, and the other members of your class will be doing slightly different projects. And so yours are not identical. Don't panic. You'll hear, but I did this and this, and I did that and that, and why but you're not doing that. Just ignore that. When you have a question, you go to your supervisor. You go to other people in your group, because otherwise you'll just work yourself into a state and you'll spend a lot of energy being anxious, when really it'd be better take that energy and either work on your project or go to a movie. But no point in being anxious about this. It's really a very specific formula to do a critical review, and if you follow the steps, you're going to be fine. Sort of like baking a cake, right? You don't there's certain order of things that you just have to do, and it makes it happen. Okay, so now you're at the final part of your paper. You're doing the discussion and conclusion. So you've got this mess of information. You've done all your data extraction. You've made some judgments about the methodological quality of the evidence. Here's a mistake that a lot of students make, because there are some bad examples out there. They just add up the number of yeses and nos that showed up on their data extraction forms. And they say, well, this study had 19 of the 24 quality criteria, so it's better than the one that has 12. But that's very flawed thinking. Think about how those forms, some of the indicators are very different levels of significance, right? Some of them are not as important as others. So don't fall for just adding them up, because that's very, that's kind of naive scholarship, all right? It doesn't show you in the best light. In your discussion, you want to talk about the relevance for occupational therapy practice, because why are you doing this if it's not about OT and something that's useful for us? You also want to talk about what type of OT theory does this question and these findings relate to, right? Is this something that's relevant to rehabilitation? So if I was looking at dorsal splints and the biomechanics and skin breakdown and stuff like that, I'd be looking kind of at a rehab model. I wouldn't be talking about MOHO or COPME, right? Because that's biomechanical and biomedical when you're talking about skin ulcers. So be sure that you align these two things properly. Your question, and then what type of theory does it address? So you've got all your findings, you've presented them, you've talked about the theory they relate to, then you talk about the implications. What does this all mean? Well, there was lots of high quality evidence, so we can confidently use this intervention. Or maybe there was limited high quality evidence, but there's a great deal of it. So the intervention appears promising, but we need to build more rigorous evidence base. Right? Just because something doesn't have a strong evidence base doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it means that we have to build that evidence. We have to test things more carefully. And one of the conclusions you would never draw is, there was no evidence, but I know it's a good thing, so we should still do it. Okay? If you want to get a C, then that's a great statement to make. A nice way to round out your paper at the end is to talk about recommendations for the future. Where should we go? Well, if we don't have much evidence, then we have to start building it. So what types of study designs are for building evidence? Okay? So the single case studies, those smaller studies that just help us start to get some theory together, some theory building. Okay? You don't start with an RCT. Remember that from class. We talked in 566 about RCTs are for where you have strong theory and you're testing it. But if we don't even have the theory yet, we don't start with an RCT. Okay, so this likely looks like you, the little guy in the bottom of the screen, and you just sort of had enough. If you've been stretching this out from when you first got your question, you're going to be fine. If you leave this all until the last month and a half before it's due, you're going to be in trouble. And I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying that because I've supervised more than 300 of these projects now in here and when I was at the University of Liverpool, and I know how long they take to do. So if you break it down into the little steps and just whittle away at it a time, remember it's that eating the elephant, one bite at a time, and you'll be so happy with what you have at the end because it will be a meaningful contribution. So how are you going to display all of these findings? You've got all this information, you've got all these data extraction forms. Well, there's two types of tables that you build for your study. And you can see these tables in the publication that we wrote that has it is a critical review. We received a grant from COTF to do this, some other instructors and myself, and Diane Cother was a student at the time, an OT student. And we wrote it specifically to give you guys a good example of what a critical review would look like. What things do you look at? How do you present the data? And it's published in CJOT, right? So it's a good model for you to go to. And we think it's good, but not just because we wrote it, but also because we wrote it, I guess. So anyway, sorry, enough rambling. I'm going to tell you about these two different types of tables you want, descriptive and evaluative. Your descriptive tables just summarize the different journal articles that you looked at, the different pieces of research. So you can see across the top here, Edelman, what was the purpose of their study, what was the design, what was the focus, the results, and the conclusion. Right? So you just lay them all out like that. But this doesn't tell us anything about the quality of the studies. This just summarizes them so the person who's reading it understands a little bit more about the study without having to look it up for themselves. So it gathers the information together, but this is not your critique yet. Then you do another table, an evaluative table or a critique table. And in this one, you put all of the different standards that you have on your data extraction form. So the study purpose, the design, the sample methods, the outcome, the intervention, so on and so forth. And then across the top, you've got all of the different publications that you're looking at. And then you just simply slot into your table. Did they meet that criteria? Yes, no, not applicable, perhaps, or if you have some little indicators, like if you look under VARCE in outcomes, you'll see there's a little qualification here. They say no for MAX, right? So that would make sense if you were looking at the article. Okay. And here, when you look at design and it says type, they've abbreviated, right? So there'll be a key to your table to help us understand what all of these different abbreviations mean. Okay. BA, before and after. Anyway, I won't go on and on about it, but that's what a table would look like. And if you go to that example, it'll help you understand what this is all about and how to lay out your information so it's really clear and accessible to people. So let's just summarize all of this stuff, right? Your critical review contains the background to the study. You want to talk about why. Why are you even doing this? How is it relevant to OT? What theory does it relate to? And make sure you pick an appropriate theory. Not, I'm going to use a biomechanical approach when I look at cognitive behavioral therapy intervention for childhood behavioral problems. That doesn't make any sense, right? So you don't want to look silly. Then you need a statement of your objectives. What is this paper all about? What's your study all about? Then a description of your methods. And remember, you don't just launch into, I did a search on Scopus. First you have to talk about, I did a critical review. And here's the method that I used according to Law et al. And I picked this one because occupational therapists wrote it and it's been around for a long time. There's documents that give you the background of this particular approach. So you want to talk about that, right? Why did you pick this method? Then you have your search strategy identified, your inclusion-exclusion criteria. You present your findings. You create those lovely tables that help everybody understand. Then you have some discussion. And then you have your conclusion. So what is this, where should we go from here? Okay, so again, one piece at a time. A lot of this you can do. You don't wait till the last minute, right? You can talk about many of these things and start even building a template for your tables. Very helpful. It all helps. 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there. It helps you get your project done. Okay, and so some last resources that you might find helpful. If you're really struggling about how to search, Brettel and Grant, they've got an interesting book about how to write PICOs. There are all kinds of tutorials on the U of A library website, but you've already done Scopus once, so brush off those skills and think about it. And many of the same lessons that you learned in Scopus will help you with CINAHL and PubMed and all the others. There's another textbook by Rumsey, How to Find Information. If you're needing to go on to internet searching for some reason, you can't find everything that you need in a Scopus search, then you want to look at the virtual training suite for allied health, because they'll help you walk through finding the right online databases that you might need to use. But most of you are going to find everything that you need within the university holdings, right? That's the whole point. You already know that those are quality journals where you should be looking, as opposed to just trying to do a Google search and hoping for the best. Because remember, I mean, when I look at your search strategy, I may decide to just type it in anyway to see if I get the same kind of findings. Okay? So you want to say when you did the search, how you did the search. Be specific. A lot of your mark rides on your methods, right? We want to know that you can do this. The most important thing is not actually, your findings. The most important thing is that you can do it because you're a beginner. So this is to show you've got the skill, and then when you graduate, a lot of practice settings actually do critical reviews of some form so that they can build their evidence because they want to start a new program or something like that. So that's when you refine your skills. Okay? Right now, you're just trying to show us that you can do it. And what's the point again, right? It's to inform best practice, and so that you can get the evidence together for your team members if you need to. If you're the OT and you're trying to convince everybody you need to start a bunion therapy program, this is how you do it. Also, it helps us guide researchers about where the gaps are. If you have some question about an intervention that everybody's doing, and then you find, oh my goodness, there is no evidence for this, we need to start to fill that gap, right? So this is where we start from. You don't want people doing a bunch of research that's already been done. That's just a waste of time. So we need to get focused. And finally, it's a skill for your whole OT career. You're going to use it over and over again. You might not do a full critical review, but certainly the ability to critique the methods of any piece of research that you're reading will be invaluable to you. So anyway, I think